Hello and welcome to the Brookings Institution. I'm Tamara Kaufman-Wittes. I'm director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy here at Brookings. And I have with me today a fantastic panel of experts from Israel and China. Here at Brookings this week, we brought together a group of Israelis, Chinese, and Americans for a unique, unprecedented set of off-the-record conversations about the U.S.-China-Israel triangle. And while we have the benefit of these fantastic experts here in Washington, we wanted to share their insights with you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yang Guang of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Dr. Yoram Evron of the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, Professor Pang Guang of the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, and Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich of the Israel Institute. Ambassador Rabinovich, perhaps I can start with you. Why a trilateral? Why is it important to get these three parties in a room together?
Well, there have been a number of both American-Israeli and Chinese-Israeli dialogues in the last few years. As you know better than anybody else, the Saban Forum is, I think correctly say, the single most important and effective American-Israeli dialogue, and there are several others. And in the last few years, there have been several meetings, dialogues between Chinese groups of academics, think tank people, government people, and their Israeli equivalents. And in these meetings, the Israeli-Chinese meetings, we always felt the absence in the room of a third party, the United States, that looms large in our thinking about the world, in the Chinese thinking about the world, and specifically about the Middle East and Israel. I'm sure our Chinese colleagues will speak for themselves, but we noticed that with the discrepancy that there is between a huge country like China and a small country like Israel, China sees value in Israel. It sees commonality. These are two ancient civilizations, two very gifted, competitive peoples. I think they appreciate Israeli creativeness, innovation. And they also appreciate Israel's close relationship with the United States. When they speak to Israel, they feel that in a way they're also speaking to Washington. So with your consent and help, we decided to actually make it happen and try to bring the three parties together and see how not a dialogue but a trialogue would proceed. We are in the middle of the first day of the trilateral, but from what I saw and heard so far, it's been a good decision.
Thank you. Professor Yang, we've spent our morning in the closed meeting talking a lot about the changing place of the Middle East in American foreign policy. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of where the Middle East fits in China's foreign policy thinking these days.
Well, the Middle East is becoming more and more important for China, because China's interests are expanding in this region. And not only this region is an important source of energy for China, it represents also a very important market of construction, for example, and a very important market for good exportation of China. And on the other hand, this region is important for China because the current Chinese foreign policy is based on the need of creating enabling environment for China's peaceful development. Therefore, we can't imagine any, a peaceful environment without peace in the Middle East. So China, as a member of Security Council, permanent member of Security Council, it shows responsibility for international peace. So China is ready to contribute more in the Middle East peace construction as well.
So would it be accurate to say that China's growing role in the Middle East is a reflection of China's sense of itself as a rising global power?
But to some extent, yes. China is interpreted as a rising power. The fact is that China's economy has grown very rapidly. So that makes the country more and more open and more involved in international affairs. So it's logical, I mean, for China to take care of the Middle East peace in increased manner. Yeah.
Dr. Evron, I wonder if you could weigh in on this issue from the Israeli side. With such a long-standing and multifaceted relationship with the United States, and that's been central to Israel's sense of its own political, security, economic future. From an Israeli side, what does China offer as it takes on a greater role in the region?
Well, China has always been a challenge for Israel. Ever since China was established, Israel tried to find a way to make relations with it. It didn't go well in the first few years. In fact, in the first 20, 25 first years. And then, when China was opened, late 70s, Israel regarded it as an opportunity to make relations to it. China has been regarded as a gate to Asia, and also as a way to break the isolation of Israel back then. And still, China has been regarded as important pillar or country in the Israeli foreign policy, although not a very central one. Later on, the last few years, two other factors came up. First of all, the economic one. Especially in the last decade, when it became clear that China develops so rapidly, not only globally but also in the Middle East, it became important for Israel to find a way to establish solid relations. The relations have gone through several crises, and it was important to put them on a more regular basis. And then, probably the latest development, as was mentioned, China becomes an important player in the Middle East. Political player, maybe also a strategic player in the future. It is important for Israel to have good relations, mutual understanding, perhaps even to give China a place in the Israeli foreign and national security policies.
So it's outreach, which is part of Israel's broader strategy of making friends in every region of the world, but it's also, in a sense, trying to bring more players into the process of maintaining security and order in the Middle East?
I'm not sure that it's about bringing more players, but rather setting good relations with players that are going to be there, are going to play a role.
Great, thank you. And Professor Pan, Ambassador Rabinovich suggested that in a way, for China, it might be that the road to Washington leads a little bit through Jerusalem. I wonder if I could get your thoughts on that. How important to China is America's attitude as China builds up its own relationships in the Middle East, particularly with Israel?
Yes. For example, China-Israel's relations now is very good, but U.S. still has the veto power on for example, China-U.S. military cooperation, China-U.S. high-tech cooperation. So it's quite important the United States plays a role in China-Israeli relations.
When you say veto power, tell me what you mean by that.
For example, we still remember 13 years ago, Israel will sell something to China. We call the Felgang, the business. And then the United States said no. So Chinese already pay the deposit, then get money back. Since then, in fact, the China-Israeli cooperation on high-tech, even military, still going very well. But the United States always have a very important fact. If U.S. said no, that would be difficult.
Of course, the U.S. and China have their own history and have worked hard in the last several years on some common interests in the Middle East. Ambassador Rabinovich, I wonder, from an Israeli perspective, how does that U.S.-Chinese cooperation on, for example, Iran sanctions, how does that look to Israel? Is this a net plus for Middle East security?
If China comes fully on board, it obviously is a net plus. Referring to the discussion we had this morning, I think there was a very clear statement by a senior Chinese participant in the discussions regarding China's support of sanctions in Iran. China also came up in the context recently, in the last 2 years, in the context of the Syrian crisis. As we all know, it's not been possible to pass a meaningful resolution with regard to Syria through the Security Council, primarily because of Russian objection, but at some point there were also Chinese hesitancy about this. I think China is less concerned with Syria as such as with the principle of the international community meddling, as they would put it, in the domestic affairs of member countries in the UN. So clearly, whether we call it emerging or already present, China is a big presence in the Middle East. It is playing a role. And if in the give and take between Washington and Beijing and Jerusalem and Beijing, we get China closer to, let's say, our respective views of the Middle East than to Moscow's view of the Middle East, that would be very important.
So, Professor Yang, I wonder, as you look at the issue of Syria, the issue of Iran, the Middle East peace process, these are minefields for powers like China and the United States with global interests and a lot of different relationships. How does China approach these very tricky topics? Where do you see common interests between the U.S. and China on these big regional issues?
I think you're right. All these issues are very difficult issues and complicated issues. But there are also issues you cannot avoid if you want to promote peace in this region. So definitely you have to do something. And I think the Chinese approach is very clear. China always sticks to the principle of promoting political settlement of these difficult issues. If you look at the Iranian nuclear issues, China has been working very hard with the international community in promoting political settlement of this issue through negotiations. China has been also involved in the sanction imposed by UN Security Council. And nowadays we are very happy to see that some progress has been made. I mean, the Geneva Accord reached by Iran and the other parties, and I think China will continue to push forward the progress in that direction. And for Syria, the Chinese principle is based on the political solution of the problem, and try to avoid any military actions. And we're also happy to see that the oppositions and the government have agreed, to negotiate. And we're going to continue to push, to give a push, and hopefully to see some concrete result. And if we talk about the Middle East peace process or the Palestinian issue, we are fully aware that it's the most difficult issue of this region. Especially, we still have to find solution for this, what we call the key issues of the peace process, such as the status of Jerusalem, the refugee problem of refugee, the border of Palestinians, so far and so on. So China, unfortunately, China has been excluded from the quartet. But despite of that, China has spent its own efforts by dispatching special envoys for mediation. Our special envoys has visit this region from time to time to Israel and to Arab countries concerned for mediation. We hope that in the future China could be accepted into the mainstream of peace promoting mechanism.
So a strong emphasis on the diplomatic tool, but also in the case of Iran, a clear recognition of the need to use pressure, sanctions, to make diplomacy effective. Dr. Avron, I wonder, two questions. First, do you think that the Israeli government would welcome China joining that quartet, turning the quartet into a quintet on the Middle East peace process? And what more do you think the Israeli government would want to see China do on a regional security issue like Iran?
The first question, I don't think that there's going to be any objection. The question is what the quartet actually was as a tool to promote a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right. Does the quartet still matter?
That's the question. But I'm sure that if China would like to play a role, the Israeli government won't be a principal objection. As for Iran, this is maybe more the role that China can play is more concrete, more specific. And here Israel expects China, like it expects other powers or countries, to use its influence on Iran in order to convince it to stop the nuclear project now. If that's too late or cannot be done, so at least to use its economic leverage, economic influence to make the sanctions work. We mentioned earlier the discussions that China does play a role as a mediator. Here also, as long as China uses its influence, its good connections with the Iranian regime, it can convince the Iranians to halt the nuclear project or to shift it to any other direction rather than the military ones. I'm sure that assistance will be welcome.
Professor Pan, in many ways, leverage is a double-edged sword. The Chinese have leverage because they're purchasers of energy in the region, but that also creates a vulnerability for China. Now, we know that China has significantly reduced its purchases of Iranian oil over the last year or two as part of this international effort to send a clear message to Tehran on the nuclear program. But as China continues to develop, as its energy needs continue to grow, how do you think that will shape China's interests and its relationships in this region?
Basically now, yes, we reduce imports of oil, but GCC will provide enough. Our Prime Minister visited Saudi, Qatar, UAE. They said, the King Abdullah said, if you don't buy oil from Iran, we will provide. And the Qatar said, we are now the #1 to China for the LNG, natural gas by ship. So basically, I think China now joined the UN session, does not agree with the United States unilateral session. But the issue is US session now became domestic law. So one Chinese company, if they have a business in both Iran and the US, the company should make a decision. If they want to keep business with US, they have to leave Iran, like Huawei, he left Iran. So, so now the situation is in the Geneva Reach Agreement, so we still have 6 months. The 5 bigger consumer, Japan, Korea, India, Turkey. We have dialogue, discuss how to coordinate this. And so after 6 months, we will see what happened. And maybe some new session, or the situation is going better. So there will be the different situation, yeah. So we still should be waiting for the next six months, yeah.
So there's been quite a discussion here in Washington, especially in the last month or two, about tensions in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and growing tensions between the United States and China over some of those East Asian security issues. I wonder, Professor Yang, when you look at the relationship between U.S.-China ties in East Asia and U.S.-China ties in the Middle East, is it a case where if East Asia sneezes, the Middle East gets a cold? Could bumps in the road in U.S.-China relations in East Asia prevent cooperation in the Middle East?
Well, I think we have to look at the issues separately. On the East China Sea and South China Sea, there are some, problems, and most of them are legacy of history. And all these issues are difficult, but China has put forward principles for solution of the issues. That is, put the dispute aside and joint development. But of course, this principle has so far has not been accepted, by all parties concerned. And so, but we are patient. I mean, China is patient, and we are confident that ultimately we can, get these issues resolved. But for the Middle East, it's a different story. United States has been the dominant external forces in this region for a very long time. And, but nowadays, what we can observe is a kind of decline of American interests in this region. For instance, with the development of shale gas and shale oil in the United States, Americans' energy dependence on this region has been declining, though the absolute volume of import from this region remain the same for many years. But on the other hand, the United States is facing also some domestic fiscal problems. So all these, have reduced the capacity and the wishes of the United States to, for its role dominant role in this region. And the United States wants to, in their words, to share the burden, share the cost, I'm sorry, for maintaining the peace of this region. And as I mentioned earlier, China's interests in this region are expanding. And there were more and more interest, in peace and economic prosperity of this region. So this is the broad background in which, we can find some, points, where we can cooperate with the United States.
So from your perspective, it sounds like there's a lot of complementarity in that you see the United States wanting to reduce some of its investments in the Middle East at a time when China is willing perhaps to step up a little more. Ambassador Rabinovich, it seems to me here we get to the crux of an issue right now in America's relationships with key partners in the Middle East, including Israel, which is this underlying anxiety that the end of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the growing energy production here in North America means that the United States maybe just doesn't care about the Middle East as much as it used to. Certainly you hear that anxiety expressed by Israelis, but also by other American partners around the region. So if that's the anxiety, how does Israel look at potential burden sharing between the United States and China in the region?
In these matters, there are subtleties and complexities, and they change over time. It's in a way ironic that Israelis and Saudis today would share a concern about the United States distancing itself from the Middle East when 20 or 30 years ago, Israelis would complain about undue Saudi influence over U.S. policy because of oil and other business interests that the United States or American corporations had in Saudi Arabia. When George Shultz, for instance, was appointed Secretary of State in 1982, concerns were voiced in Israel that somebody who had to do with the Bechtel Corporation would become Secretary of State. And lo and behold, 30 years later, Saudis and Israelis share concerns. They also share the concern with Iran's nuclear program. So these perspectives are more complex than meets the eye, and they do change over time. Now, I'm also of the view that the United States is not in such a hurry to leave the Middle East. I think it's more a question of willing to invest, particularly military power and other major investments, and not so much losing interest. For the United States, to begin with Washington, to have China join, let's say, the quartet or in any other form of partnership, I think would run against the view that you do meet in Washington, that there is a potential for American-Chinese collisions over issues in Asia. I mean, shifting from the Middle East to the Asia-Pacific area doesn't mean that you leave a stormy area for the tranquil water of another ocean. There are plenty of problems and potential problems there. So I'm sure that Israel would be interested in listening to what Washington has to say about that, and it also have to make its own judgment. It's one thing to have a better relationship with China. It's the other to have enough trust in Chinese, say, even objectivity in Middle Eastern affairs. If you look at, let's say, the record on UN voting, the Chinese record from an Israeli point of view is not very promising. So it will take a process a fairly long process for all three parties to this process to build enough mutual confidence or trilateral confidence for this to materialize.
No, it's a very good point. So common interests may be there, but the trust required to build on those common interests has yet to be developed. So Professor Pan, I wonder if you have some ideas as we look ahead, what could be done to help create that environment of trust?
In fact, between China and Israel, between China and the United States, we all have the common interest. But in different cases, for example, on the Israel-Palestinian issue, in fact, the U.S. and China have almost the same position about the settlement. But another issue, Egypt, China and Israel almost have same position. Mm-hmm. We strongly support the military leaders to control the situation, but the United States have some different opinion, human rights or something like that. So, but the three countries basically, I think, have common interest in to keep the stability, anti-terrorism, promote the economic cooperation. So I think we can do more through the culture. Dialogue, civilization, young people exchange, and also through the scholars like us. I have more seminars like this to discuss different possibilities, so promote a mutual trust. Yeah.
Dr. Evron, how common is it to have Israeli scholars specializing in China or Israel-Chinese relations?
It's not too common. And the reason is, as I mentioned before, that the notion that China becomes part of the Middle East and will become probably an important part of Israel's foreign policy, national security policy, is probably doesn't have...
it's uncomfortable?
Probably that notion is not absorbed yet. If I may come back or go back to the question of the Israeli Palestinians and the involvement of China and the Chinese role in the Middle East, and this is also part of the answer to your question, probably one of the problems is that it is not clear enough, not to Israel and probably not also to the US and maybe also to other players in the region, what role China is going to play or intends to play. The Quartet, for example. What exactly China wants? Does it want to be part of the Quartet, or does it want to play a role in finding a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian question? This is not the same thing. I think that, as Professor Pan said, things should be elaborated more, should get clearer, should be more discussions about China's future role in the region, how the Chinese interest get along with the American interest, and where exactly Israel fits in.
Great. Well, I think our 2 days together in this trilateral meeting are a good opportunity to begin creating greater clarity amongst all three parties about their mutual interests, about their intentions, and in that way perhaps to build the foundation for cooperation where it's mutually beneficial. We'll have coming out from this trilateral meeting a summary of the discussions, and that will give all of you a chance to benefit further from the insights of these fantastic experts, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. So thank you all for joining me, Ambassador Rabinovich, Professor Pan, Dr. Evron, Professor Yang. Thank you all very much for being part of our conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.